The Resident Evil series, developed by Capcom, has solidified itself as one of the most iconic franchises in the survival horror genre. Beginning with Resident Evil in 1996, the series has spanned multiple sequels, spin-offs and remakes, and recently, in the last few years, Capcom has successfully revitalized several of its earlier entries, including Resident Evil 2, 3 and 4, all of which receiving full remakes that garnered widespread critical acclaim. Of course, some of these remakes did better than one another, but regardless, all of them did a very good job in bringing the classic games to the modern day. And with these remakes in the minds of fans, rumours began to circulate not too long ago about a potential remake of the original Resident Evil, the game that started it all the way back in 1996. The original Resident Evil was a groundbreaking game, introducing players to the claustrophobic and terrifying Spencer Mansion, where they had to survive against zombies, mutated creatures, and puzzling, deadly traps. Its legacy was bolstered by a GameCube remake in 2002, which significantly enhanced the game's graphics, gameplay mechanics, and atmosphere, elevating it as one of the best survival horror games of all time. Given its history and importance, fans have long wondered whether Capcom would revisit Resident Evil 1 once again using the modern technologies that they have access to now. The modern remakes of Resident Evil 2, 3 and 4 have set a new standard for survival horror remakes and even for remakes in the gaming industry as a whole, utilising Capcom's RE engine to recreate those classic environments, models and atmospheres in high detail and making it way more lifelike, intense and immersive. These remakes not only attracted nostalgic fans, but also introduced new audiences to the classic games, while retconning some events so it makes more sense for players who want to experience the entire franchise as a whole, as of course with a franchise that's ran as long as this, there was always going to be loopholes and little areas of the story that didn't seem to fit well together over a long period of time, where we have callbacks in Resident Evil 8 for example that go back to Resident Evil 1, and in some cases this did call for a retcon just so it made more sense in a modern story. Following this trend, many fans began to speculate that Capcom might continue its remake strategy, and naturally many fans turned to the idea of having another remake, but this time of course in the RE engine of Resident Evil 1. While Capcom hasn't said anything officially about a Resident Evil 1 remake, several factors have fueled this rumour. The first and obvious one being Capcom has demonstrated a clear intent to revisit its older titles, as evidenced by the remakes I listed earlier. This consistent trend suggests that Capcom is willing to explore more remakes, especially given the commercial success of these titles. So the question is not whether or not Capcom will be continuing to make these remakes, it's more of a case of which title will be next, whether that is Code Veronica, Resident Evil 5, Resident Evil 6, or of course Resident Evil 1. The other reason that we had to think that this rumour could be true is in 2020, during a major ransomware attack on Capcom's internal systems, several documents were leaked revealing potential future projects, and while some of the projects mentioned have come to fruition, like the Resident Evil 4 remake, there were also references to other untitled Resident Evil projects. And although Resident Evil 1 was not explicitly named in these leaks, the community has speculated that it is only a matter of time before this becomes Capcom's focus and they make a full-fledged remake of the original. One of the strongest indicators of a potential Resident Evil 1 remake is the vocal demand from the fanbase. Capcom is not shy about taking in feedback from the community and actually executing on it. It is clear that fans are wanting this remake. They've used social media platforms, fan forums, and their gaming communities to make sure that their call is being heard for a modern remake of the original Resident Evil. Fans do argue that even though we do have the GameCube remake in its nice high quality graphics, it is still at a fixed camera angle and has a strong essence of that classic style of Resident Evil, whereas the Resident Evil 2, 3 and 4 remakes have gone with that more modernized technology. And putting this into Resident Evil 1's framework could offer a more immersive and refined experience, especially if Capcom were to use the same RE engine that powered the recent entries, which of course would make sense unless they had an upgraded version of this engine, or even just a new engine altogether that takes over the RE engine, which I don't see happening anytime soon, but you never know. Regardless, the point remains the same. The possibility of seeing the Spencer Mansion with photorealistic lighting, dynamic shadows, and improved gameplay mechanics excites long-time, I can't speak anymore, long-time fans of the series, so I'm sure Capcom does have this up their sleeve to be released within the next few years, if not even within the next year or two. But of course, time will tell. While there is a lot of excitement around the idea of a Resident Evil 1 remake, there are also some concerns, as you would expect with revitalizing a classic and iconic entry in the gaming industry as a whole. The first of which being the preservation of the atmosphere. One of the main challenges for Capcom would be preserving the iconic atmosphere of the original game. The claustrophobic nature of the Spencer Mansion and the slow, deliberate pacing of the gameplay contributed to its intense atmosphere, and some fans fear that a remake could inadvertently dilute the horror in an attempt to modernize the game's mechanics, as was the case with the Resident Evil 3 remake, which was criticized for being too action orientated. Even though the original did go for an action take on its classic style, it still maintained a lot of the horror elements, which the 3 remake didn't manage to do as well as the original or even the RE2 remake. The second point being oversaturation. With so many remakes being released in such a short span of time, some critics worry that Capcom might risk oversaturating the market with remakes, and if the company continues focusing on rehashing its older entries, there is a possibility that fans could experience fatigue, leading to diminishing returns and a potential downfall once again for the Resident Evil series, which would be a massive shame given the extreme efforts that they went to for the series to be revitalized and resurged with Resident Evil 7, so it would be a shame if they did ruin that momentum, but I really doubt Capcom would go in that direction. It does seem like they have learnt their lesson for the most part. And then finally, the last challenge or concern with a remake of the original would be the case of being able to strike a good balance. Capcom would need to strike a delicate balance between honouring the original game's design and updating it for modern audiences, while of course making sure it's modernised in a very good way. Resident Evil 2 was a perfect example of how they did it well, and 3 was just unfortunately the perfect example of how they messed up, and Capcom clearly did learn from this, as with Resident Evil 4 they did manage to capture the original in a very good way. Of course, many do argue that the original is still better than the remake, and vice versa, but for the most part, in my opinion at least, I think Resident Evil 4 did do a good job in taking Resident Evil 4's original release and modernising it as well as they possibly could. The original did feature, of course, the fixed camera angles and tank controls, which contributed to its unique feel, so pulling this out could be a cause for concern. However, these elements might not appeal to contemporary players accustomed to the over-the-shoulders perspective used in the recent games, and it would make sense for them to use over-the-shoulder, as this was the style of camera used for 2 and 3, which of course were both originally fixed camera angles in their original releases, so I'm sure many fans wouldn't be too fussed about this choice, but there is always the option, if they want to go above and beyond, to just add both camera angles and then maybe make it so you can't switch the camera angle in game, and the enemies will react slightly differently depending on which camera angle you start that save with. But regardless of how they execute this remake, of course when the time comes, balancing nostalgia with modern game design would be a key factor in the remake's success. While there is no official confirmation from Capcom yet regarding a Resident Evil 1 remake, it is clear to see that the community is demanding it based on how all the forums and Reddit threads are fueling this idea of a potential Resident Evil 1 remake on the way, and I think the success of the recent Resident Evil remakes does make it a plausible candidate for a modern reimagining, and if Capcom can successfully update the game while preserving the elements that made the original a classic, a remake of Resident Evil 1 could prove to be another milestone for the iconic franchise. Whether it becomes a reality or remains a hopeful rumour, one thing is clear: the appetite for more Resident Evil remakes is strong, and the potential for a return to the Spencer Mansion is an exciting prospect for both new and old fans alike. And with that said, guys, that does bring us to the end of this video. Of course, be sure to drop your thoughts in the comments down below as to what you think about a Resident Evil 1 remake, and I look forward to reading how the discussion continues. As always, a like would be extremely appreciated if you did enjoy the video. It does help the channel a ton, and I appreciate all of your support on the channel thus far. Be sure to smash the subscribe button for a lot more Resident Evil content. Don't forget to join our Discord, link is at the top of the description. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you all in the next one. Bye.